In 2007, the U.S. Supreme Court decided in Massachusetts versus Environmental Protection Agency that EPA needed to determine whether carbon dioxide was a pollutant. EPA took 2 years to decide, yes, it is. They then spent another 3 years to come up with the rule that was finally promulgated in March of 2012 that said that coal-fired plants, new plants, will need to capture more carbon dioxide emissions using technology that doesn't currently exist on existing power plants. So the coal industry, at least, is happy that it only applies to new plants. However, those who oppose the rules say that it will kill new coal plants and that they can't achieve that technology. So we'll have to see where that ends up. In mid-April of 2012, the Environmental Protection Agency promulgated a rule concerning emissions from hydrofracking of natural gas from shale fields, primarily the Marcellus shale fields in Appalachia, but also out west. And so that will require capturing more of the gases and air emissions from hydrofracking operations. It does not address impacts on water sources. That's separately being looked at. However, that rule will not go into effect until January 1, 2015. So again, it leaves both sides or all sides a little bit unhappy with the results of that. So rulemaking by EPA has been a means of addressing, to some degree, climate change mitigation when Congress has not been able to do it itself. And at the international level, in terms of climate change mitigation, we just had the International Conference in Durban, South Africa in 2012, December. That had mixed results. It did not accomplish what some people wanted. It accomplished a little more than others thought it might accomplish. It essentially kept alive the Kyoto Protocol mechanisms of trying to have targets, trying to have emission trading, trying to have clean development mechanisms or ways of achieving goals for essentially the 35 or so industrial nations who were left, who were in the original Kyoto back in the early 2000s of trying to achieve those goals. The problem now, though, with Kyoto and post-Durban is that Canada has pulled out of it because they were not achieving the Kyoto goals of reducing their greenhouse gas emissions on the schedule required by Kyoto. So they've pulled out. There are other countries, I think Japan and Russia, who have said they may not continue with it past 2012. The U.S. never signed Kyoto. And then actively developing countries now of China, India, and Brazil were never part of Kyoto because they were not considered industrial nations for greenhouse gas purposes at the time of Kyoto. So that has a mixed bag of results, and it's ultimately some of the European countries, Russia, France, Germany, are ahead of schedule on their greenhouse gas reductions, but most of the countries are not. And so from an international perspective, climate change mitigation, while it's underway, is still not happening as quickly as the IPCC or other climate scientists say it needs to in order to stay under the targets that were set years ago and that probably are out of date because we're still burning more coal, we're still emitting more fossil fuels into the emissions from the fossil fuels into the atmosphere. Our population growth is continuing, our use of electricity is continuing, and while we still have energy efficiency and electricity efficiency measures in effect, ultimately the global impact is we're still heating up and we are not likely to achieve, whether it's 350 parts per million or other targets that some have set. The bottom line is we're going to need more mitigation. And if we need more mitigation, that means we're going to need more adaptation, which means that we already have baked into our atmosphere sufficient levels of carbon dioxide, methane, and ultimately greenhouse gas emissions that sea level rise is pretty much inevitable. Temperature changes are inevitable. Impacts on weather patterns are inevitable. It's only a question of how much and what the magnitude is. So we're really likely to have, again, the predictions are a little bit variable, whether it's a meter rise in sea level by 2100 or more. The polar ice caps are melting faster than originally predicted. That will release more methane gas from the tundras of Russia and other places, and the permafrost, which will create an accelerating effect, sort of a loop effect, feedback effect on climate change. We'll have the sea level rise, which will impact coastal communities. Most of the world, a lot of the large cities are on the coast, and how much that sea level rise will be, again, will impact people property-wise, economically, and otherwise. There are going to be significant impacts on our forests, and forests are both tools for mitigation as well as, to some degree, adaptation. For mitigation, deforestation accelerates greenhouse gas emissions because the trees don't absorb carbon dioxide if they're not replaced, and the burning of the trees then creates more carbon emissions that are released. And so trying to increase forestation, afforestation is the term in the world, would be a form of adaptation as well as mitigation, or reducing emissions from deforestation in developing countries, or REDD is another greenhouse gas tool or vehicle for mitigation. But so focusing on places like Brazil, Indonesia, and the Congo Basin are the three largest tropical rainforests in the world. Those are significant places that people are looking at, because also there's a concern that if temperature goes up by more than 2 degrees centigrade, anywhere 3-4 degrees centigrade, that the Amazon, for example, will start drying up, and that you'll start having more fires there, which will release more carbon into the atmosphere. So you have issues of sea level rise. Public health will be impacted by climate change, so increasing temperatures ends up, you start having destructive pests moving further northward, for example, in the United States. So you have the pine borer beetle going into places it wasn't before in the Canadian Rockies. You therefore have Maine, which is the most heavily forested state in the United States. Our forests are increasingly under pressure, so the species that you have traditionally had in Maine are starting to shift. They're starting to be exposed to types of pests or beetles or diseases they weren't exposed to and therefore adapted to before. So you may impact the Maine forests more. Habitat in Maine is shifting so that on a mountain, for example, in Maine, birds that may have been used to habitat at, say, 2,000-foot elevation now are having to move up the mountains. Those that were more used to closer to mountaintop habitats are losing that habitat and essentially are having to look further north. You have ocean impacts. Oceans are increasingly acidifying from the climate change emissions, greenhouse gas emissions, as well as increased runoff from our rivers. And so ultimately that's impacting coral, sea coral, as well as it's going to impact fisheries. As the waters continue to warm, you'll see different fish harvests moving north. So lobsters, which like cold water in Maine, a key part of our fishing industry, may start shifting a little bit year by year northward. Other ground fishing will be impacted as well. So ultimately, climate change is not just an environmental issue. It's a public health issue, it's an economic issue, and it's essentially a quality of life and also an intergenerational issue, because what we're doing to the climate now, the environment now, ecology now, will impact our children and our grandchildren, the next generations, and that raises ethics and philosophical issues that are really, in part or in theory, variables in both mitigation and adaptation. How much of the cost do you put on the future generations? It's sort of like the national debt and the debate about how much debt do we pass on to our children and grandchildren from this generation And it's the same thing in the environment. It's an ecological debt that we're incurring that we're not fully paying the costs of, if you think of it from an economic perspective. So ultimately, what are the biggest roadblocks to adapting to or mitigating climate change over the next 10, 20, 30 years? Just the example of how long it's taken Congress and the courts to deal with carbon dioxide, 5, 10 plus years, is an example of how the process doesn't work. In my view, most of the environmental laws that were enacted, Clean Water Act, Clean Air Act, Endangered Species Act, were enacted in the 1970s before climate change was really focused on, understood, and the science developed. And so environmental laws, primarily National Environmental Policy Act included, focused on slowing down project development, taking more studies, being more analytical, requiring more multidisciplinary looks at projects. And that was fine in the 70s and 80s, but it's my personal view and philosophy that particularly for clean energy projects, we apply the old rules to the current day standards, we will never, ever accomplish the goals of trying to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions sufficiently to make a difference and to achieve the renewable energy goals that we've set for ourselves. So I think we're going to have to do something about law and policy as it relates to these clean energy projects. We are going to have to deal with issues of psychology and motivation, because ultimately how you get individuals, consumers, voters to care about something that they can't see, they can't put their arms around, that seems to impact the world globally, but maybe not them directly on a day-to-day basis, that's a critical piece for people to both understand and then design programs as to how to motivate people to reduce electricity consumption, reduce gas mileage consumption, to spend more money on things that may not have the immediate visible payback, and ultimately how to get politicians who are motivated by fundraising to look beyond the next election cycle and to really look 5, 10, 20, 30 years down the road for when they're out of office, but to make the tough decisions and to make the sacrifices now necessary to avoid passing on what will be not only a huge economic debt to the next generation, but will probably be a huge ecological debt, the scope of which we probably we can't fully envision, although there are people who have been doing that visioning. If you look at work by someone named Mark Lynas, which is Lynas, a British journalist and writer, he's written about scenarios of 6 degrees centigrade. So for each 1 degree centigrade increase in the global environment, what will that mean on the ground in different parts of the world? And you can go online and click and see what some of those look like. And it looks so science fiction when you get to 3, 4, 5 degrees centigrade. It's truly scary at one level, but it's the reality that may hit us if we don't act sooner. So roadblocks are really personal motivation, political motivation, dealing with the fossil fuel industries who, because they're economically motivated, it's capitalism, they want to extract as much money as they can from existing sources and to mine as much coal, to pump as much oil, to extract as much natural gas as they can, sell it for whatever, as high price as they can, and make whatever profits they can. And they're incented to do that. The problem is the impacts that come from it. And so if Congress cannot act ultimately on those climate change, adaptation, and mitigation goals, then the question is going to be how many states are willing and able to do maybe what California is trying to do, and a few other states at lesser levels of really aggressively going after climate change mitigation and adaptation at their levels. Localities can try to do some things, but and which are good to do, as are same with individuals, what light bulbs you use, turning off lights, things like that. But ultimately, the big picture is going to require big action, and so that's where I see the primary obstacles to be, and where every student in the course who's taking this course will hopefully continue to educate themselves, arm themselves with information, take courses beyond the one this summer, whether it's the energy courses that and climate change courses I'll be teaching with others, the multidisciplinary ones next year. But the more you know, hopefully the more you'll act, and the more that you will be part of the solution and not of the problem.